Hello, everybody. I am John Allen, and this is Last Week in the Church, the show where we sift through the torrent, the raging waters of the last week on the Vatican beat in an effort to lift up those few nuggets of gold you really want to have. Here's what we've got for you this week. We begin with a conspicuous absence. It is now 10 days since Pope Francis issued a historic letter to the Jews of Israel. Jewish reaction has been conspicuous mostly by being absent. We'll explain what that is and what to make of it. Second, about face. Argentina's first female saint works yet another miracle on Sunday by bringing together the progressive Pope of Argentina and the country's new right-wing anarcho-capitalist populist president, a man who once called the Pope an imbecile. In a warm, loving embrace, we'll explain what that was about and what its potential significance may be. Third up this week, we've got the politics of memory, how the largely forgotten story of an Italian tragedy illustrates the way that politics not only polarizes the present, but sometimes colonizes the past, not just in the wider world, but also in the Catholic Church. Fourth, we've got of wiretaps and wrongdoing, how the latest Italian corruption saga actually has an important insight for us about how to make sense of Vatican finance stories. We'll explain what happened and what that significance is. And then finally this week, we've got When the Cows Come Home. A now famous Italian cow made a surprise guest appearance at Pope Francis's noontime Angelus address this past Sunday. We'll explain what Ercolina II was doing in St. Peter's Square and what to make of all of that. All that and more is waiting for you on this week's show, so please don't go anywhere because we will be right back. This is our official Last Week in the Church infomercial, because I come to you with a special offer for all of those would-be Catholic eggheads out there. That is, if you're the kind of person who likes sounding smart, who likes creating the impression that you know things other people don't, that certainly describes me. If that describes you, you're going to want to know about this. Now, I've already spoken about this new app, this new online resource called Magisterium AI. Basically, what it allows you to do is to type in a question like, what does it mean that the Pope is infallible? Or what does the Catholic Church teach about the environment? Or, whatever. And it will give you a short, smart, easily digestible answer based on more than 5,000 official magisterial texts. But recently, these guys have created a new feature on the app. It's called the scholarly mode, which draws not just on official texts, but also the best and brightest of Catholic thinkers and theologians over the centuries, from Augustine and Aquinas to more contemporary figures. And we'll also give you a very quick answer about what those folks have had to say about what the Church teaches on various issues. Now, I promise you that if you try this once, you're going to wonder how in God's name you ever lived without it. It's brought to you by our friends at Longbeard. They are the digital marketing and design company that provide the IT backbone for Crux. They provide the same service for a slew of other Catholic organizations and outfits. They're brilliant, and they are creative, and they are tremendous. And I'm kind of out of adjectives at this point, which is saying something because I traffic in adjectives. But I am telling you, these people are the absolute level best. So check it out. This is Magisterium AI, their new scholarly mode. You're gonna dig it. Magisterium.com, that is magisterium.com. It comes with my personal guarantee. All right, everybody, happy Tuesday to you. Happy Tuesday, February 13th in the year of our Lord 2024. Before we dive in this week, just a brief programming note. I am not going to be here next Tuesday because I am, well, in the trade, we would say I'm on assignment, but basically that means I'm going to be on the road. Now, the good news is, if you happen to be this coming week in the Southern California area, we have the opportunity to get together in person On February 17th and 18th, I will be speaking at the Religious Education Congress in Anaheim. You can find details for those presentations just by Googling Religious Education Congress Anaheim 2024. Then the 19th and 20th, I will be speaking in the University Series in Whittier and in Ventura County up in the northern LA region. And again, if you just Google University Series Catholic, you will find full information on those appearances. So if you are in the Southland, I would love to see you. Make your way, and we will interface, as we say in the trade. All right, let's dive into the news this week. We begin with a conspicuous absence. So we spoke last week on this show about a letter, not quite unprecedented, but certainly very rare letter, that Pope Francis released to all the Jews of Israel on the 3rd of February. It was in response to an open letter that was originally the work of 5 different Jewish academics. Eventually, it was signed by more than 400 different personalities from across the Jewish world, which was addressed to Pope Francis in November regarding his response to the ongoing war between Israel and Hamas on the Gaza Strip. In this letter, the Pope committed the Catholic Church once again to the struggle against anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism. He talked about how he was heartsick to see an increase in anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism since the war in Gaza had begun. He said that the Catholic Church has committed itself to partnership with Judaism and said, we had hoped that the cry never again would echo through the ages, but the recent spike in anti-Jewish sentiment around the world has reminded us of how important it is that we work in collaboration, that is, Catholics and Jews, to combat this worrying trend. Now, of course, all of that, in general, you would think, would be very welcome messaging from a pontiff in the Jewish world. And in general, you would think a pope addressing Jews in the middle of an international crisis would be a big deal. I remember when I got on this beat more than 25 years ago. It was during another time of great turbulence in Catholic-Jewish relations, some of it very positive, involving, for instance, the late Pope John Paul II's unforgettable 2000 trip to the Western Wall in Jerusalem, when he left behind that handwritten note apologizing for centuries of Christian anti-Semitism. Some of that turbulence was negative. The debates over wartime Pope Pius XII and his alleged silence on the Holocaust. But in any event, there was a lot of action. And I remember a colleague at the time looked at me and he said, "Kid, never forget, Jews is news." What he meant is that whenever the Vatican and the Catholic Church and Jews and the Jewish world intersect in a news story, it's going to be a big deal. And therefore, you would think that this letter the Pope released 10 days ago would, by definition, have been a big deal. You would think it would be the source of a great deal of reaction and commentary and debate and even consternation. And what is really remarkable is that if you sift through the evidence of the last 10 days, there's been almost none of that at all. I mean, in fairness, the American Jewish Committee in the United States did put out a statement describing the Pope's letter as welcome and expressing gratitude for it. Well, one of those 5 original scholars who worked in that open letter to the Pope in November posted a statement on X, the social media platform formerly known as Twitter, expressing her gratitude, saying thank you at Pontifex. And here in Italy, the president of the Jewish community in Milan also went on record as saying he was grateful the Pope put the letter out. But really, that has been about it. Other than that, the silence has been pretty deafening. Now, what are we to make of this climate of what? Restraint, discretion, benign neglect? What are we to make of it? Well, I think what we're to make of it is what many Jewish leaders will tell you in private conversation, is that on the one hand, Jews are obviously grateful that a pope has come out publicly against anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism at a time when it is spiking in many parts of the world, particularly here in Europe, in Western Europe, because of frictions regarding the war in Gaza. But on the other hand, Many Jewish leaders are also not prepared to forgive and forget the irritations that have arisen in their relationship with this Pope in the Vatican because of what's going on in Gaza. Specifically, they would cite three things. Number one, they complain that the Pope still has not clearly condemned Hamas terrorism or distinguished between the fact that Hamas started this conflict with its sneak attack on October 7th, while Israel perceives itself to be engaged in a legitimate war of self-defense. Secondly, they are irritated that the Vatican has not firmly and unambiguously denied reports from a group of Palestinians who met with Pope Francis in November that in talking about the Israeli offensive in Gaza, he used the word genocide. There was sort of a weak denial from the Vatican spokesperson saying, hey, based on what I know, he didn't say that. But when the Palestinians who took part in this group insisted that he did, saying that all 10 of them had clearly heard him say it, the Vatican never responded. And so it sort of left that hanging. That has caused friction. And then finally, there also are many Jewish leaders who would argue that Pope Francis has a kind of moral obligation to defend the reaction of not only the nation of Israel, but world Judaism generally to what's going on in Gaza, and to say that this is not an occasion to beat up on the Jewish community. And for all of these reasons, there continues to be a bit of frisson. They would also, by the way, many Jews would also like the Pope to rein in some other leaders in the Catholic world who they would perceive to be making equally or even more unbalanced statements, such as the Latin Patriarchate of Jerusalem. Anyway, all of that is in the air, and collectively what it means is that while Jews may be privately grateful, they are not going to publicly heap praise upon the Pope until they see some movement on some of these other points. Finally, the Pope is drawing some fire for this letter even from in his own house. There is a Catholic theologian in Salzburg, Gregor Maria Hoff, who on other issues is clearly a big Pope Francis fan. He is a liberal Catholic theologian. He supports the synodal way in Germany. He supports the Pope's Synod on synodality. And yet he has been very critical of this letter from Pope Francis for failing to, and I'm quoting here, failing to call a spade, failing to say that it's Hamas that started this conflict in Israel that is responding to it. So all of that goes to show that probably there's still some ground to cover before one can say the Catholic-Jewish relationship is firmly back on track. All right, second up this week, we've got an about face. So candidate Javier Milei, the self-described anarcho-libertarian in Argentina, on the campaign trail had some, and I am trafficking in euphemisms here, had some unflattering things to say about Argentina's native son, who currently is sitting on the throne of Peter, calling him at various points, and I am quoting here, an imbecile, a dirty leftist, a communist, and apologies, I know this is a family show, but Milei also called the Pope a son of a bitch. Now, collectively, all of that created the impression that Milei just isn't quite Francis's guy. And the fact that he nevertheless won the Argentinian presidency, and by a fairly comfortable margin, therefore sent some shockwaves around the world, and the forecast was for a fairly stormy church-state relationship in Argentina on Milei's watch. But flash forward now a few months, as we speak, right now, as we are filming this video, President Javier Milei of Argentina is in the Vatican meeting with Pope Francis. This comes a day after yesterday, well, of course, this is Monday that we're recording this, so on Sunday, Milei was at the canonization mass for a new Argentinian saint, Argentina's first female saint, known popularly as Mama Antula, an 18th century consecrated lay woman who was known for serving the poor and also for fostering devotion to St. Ignatius of Loyola at a time when the Jesuits had been kicked out and suppressed in Argentina. And at that canonization mass, Milei made a point of literally wrapping Pope Francis in a warm, loving embrace. He went over to the Pope, seated in his wheelchair, gave him a big bear hug, and used a radio interview here in Rome to describe Pope Francis as the most important Argentinian in history. Now, how do we get from you're a son of a bitch to you're the most important guy our country has ever produced? Well, I would suggest that probably the main factor here is the difference between campaigning and governing. As a candidate, Milei needed to light up the scoreboard with, kind of incendiary statements that kept him in the news and that played to his base. But as the governor now of a country that is bitterly divided and grappling with a protracted and severe financial crisis, he finds himself needing to build consensus. And obviously, one way to try to reach out to his opposition is to be shown to being solicitous and polite to the figure that most of his opposition would look at as their champion, i.e. Pope Francis. Now, part of it also is that Francis himself has been remarkably gracious about all of this. When he was asked in an interview about Milei's rhetoric, he said, look, people say all kinds of things when they're running for office. You just got to wait to see what they do once the campaign is over. I'm not bothered by it. And so all of that has sort of paved the way for what would appear to be a remarkably, in fact, in the spirit of Sunday's canonization, I would argue almost miraculous rapprochement between two figures who were sort of seen politically as matter and antimatter. By the way, as we are filming this, we don't yet know what the content of the Monday meeting between Pope Francis and Milei will be. Possible there may be some news about the Pope's much anticipated trip to Argentina that will come out of it. Obviously, keep your eyes on the Crux site. We will have full coverage as it breaks. All right, third up this week, we've got the politics of memory. So Saturday here in Italy was what the Italians call the Giorno del Ricordo, basically the Day of Remembrance. And it commemorates a largely forgotten and deeply tragic chapter of Italian history during and shortly after the Second World War. Basically, what happened is that prior to World War II, there was a portion of territory on the Istrian Peninsula, on the eastern side of the Adriatic Sea, that belonged to the Kingdom of Italy, in territory that today is part of Slovenia and Croatia. Towards the end of the Second World War, the communist partisans in what was then Yugoslavia, under their new leader, Marshal Tito, began advancing and claiming these territories. After the war, those territories were formally taken away from Italy and assigned to the new Yugoslavia. And amid all this ferment what happened was that Tito launched an aggressive Slavicization campaign in these territories. Basically, he wanted to empty them of their Italian population and fill them up with Slavs who would be loyal to the regime in Belgrade. Amid this campaign, about 12 to 15,000 innocent, unarmed Italian civilians were executed. Their bodies were tossed into these deep mountain cisterns in this part of the world that are known in Italian as the foibe, basically these underground cisterns and caves, which became mass graves. And roughly 350,000 Italians were driven into exile. The Giorno del Ricordo recalls all of this. By the way, one of the aspects of this ferocious crackdown on the Italian population, basically it was a forerunner of what today we call ethnic cleansing. One of the hallmarks of this campaign was a very strong attack on the Catholic Church, which in this region at the time was largely led by Italian clergy and Italian bishops, who were seen as more loyal to Rome than to Belgrade. And this is on top of the fact, of course, that the Yugoslav regime was officially Marxist and therefore atheist. Some of the things that happened to Catholic clergy are almost mind-numbing in their barbarism. One can think, for instance, of Father Angelo Tartucci, who was a 36-year-old pastor of a parish on the Istrian Peninsula, who was arrested by Tito's forces. He was tortured and then eventually killed, tossed into one of these mass graves. When his body was found a month later, he was found completely naked. A crown of thorns had been shoved onto his bloody head. His genitals had been sliced off and stuffed in his throat. This is the kind of mind-numbing persecution that was going on at the time. Another priest by the name of Father Francesco Bonifacio was also arrested by Tito's forces. He was beaten on the head with a rock, then his throat was cut. His remains were never found. They presumably ended up in another of these mass graves. Bonifacio was beatified in 2008. A process is open for Tarticchio, but has not reached conclusion. Now, you would think, given the horrors and the scale of the atrocities that occurred, this would be the kind of story that for the last 80 years would have been universally known here in Italy, the kind of thing that school kids would be taught, that there would be monuments and parks and, movies. There would be a kind of Schindler's List that would tell this story, and so on. Instead, this story fell into what Italian President Sergio Mattarella has called a wall of silence and oblivion, largely because of politics. During the Second World War here in Italy, the anti-fascist resistance had a strong communist component. And so after the war, when Italians were debating, what stories that they wanted to memorialize, the Italian left was strongly against making a big deal out of what had happened on the Istrian Peninsula because, frankly, it made the communists look bad. And meanwhile, on the right, there were people who made a fetish out of trying to play up this story because it served their ideological purposes. So it got swept up into the sausage grinder of left v right politics and was basically ignored for decades. It's only been since 2004 that Italians had a national observance. And in Catholic terms, one of the great ironies is that most Italian Catholics could tell you the stories of non-Italian martyrs from World War II. They could tell you the story of Father Maximilian Kolbe, for instance, or they could tell you the story of St. Edith Stein, but they do not know the stories of Angelo Tarticchio or Francesco Bonifacio because they have not been taught and they have not been celebrated. What's the lesson here? Obviously not that we shouldn't tell the stories of Maximilian Kolbe or Edith Stein, that we shouldn't tell the story of the anti-fascist resistance in Italy, for which many leftists and many communists gave their lives in the most heroic fashion imaginable. Not that we shouldn't tell the story of the Holocaust or any other horror. It's just that what we ought to do is recognize sacrifice, recognize suffering, recognize heroism wherever it happens and regardless of its provenance, rather than allowing politics to decide whose suffering and whose heroism we remember and whose we ignore. That is the story of the Giorno del Ricordo, and that's a story and it is a lesson that applies not just to the secular world, but also, alas, at times, to the selective memory inside the Catholic Church as well. Fourth up this week, of wiretaps and wrongdoing. So, a new corruption probe here in Italy recently resulted in the arrest of a 52-year-old Italian businessman by the name of Gabriele Visco, who is the son of a former minister of finance here in Italy, and 4 other individuals who are charged with trying to rig the competitive bidding process for a public works contract worth about $4.3 million to steer it to companies that they controlled. And, roughly $250,000 in their assets have been seized. The investigation is ongoing. As part of the investigation, their phones were wiretapped for months while Italian financial police were conducting this probe. And one of the things to come out of those wiretaps is that they weren't just trying to rig the bidding process in the Italian civil sector. They were also trying to con the Vatican. They refer explicitly to efforts to try to curry favor with Italian Cardinal Pietro Parolin, who is the Vatican's Secretary of State, in order to get a kind of blessing from Parolin that would allow them then to win contracts to do renovation jobs for church properties up and down the Italian peninsula, again, bypassing competitive bidding processes on the basis of this kind of slightly sleazy form of patronage. Now, let us be clear that there is not only no evidence that Parolin ever gave them his blessing, there is actually no evidence that Parolin ever met them or even knew this was happening. I mean, in other words, this was a plot that they were kind of hatching amongst themselves that never rose to the level of ending up on Paroline's desk. In fact, in one of these wiretaps, Visco refers to his concern that he actually got fired from a job that he had with an Italian public ministry because people were suspicious of the inroads that he was trying to make in the Vatican. So I think this is one of those cases where the Vatican's hands, so far as we know, were pretty clean. But here's the insight. A lot of times we will read stories about alleged corruption in Vatican finances, right? We will hear, for instance, this famous land deal, real estate deal that the Vatican engaged in London that triggered their trial of the century, that ended in the convictions of 10 individuals, including a cardinal of the church. And we will regard these as evidence of malfeasance, corruption, and wrongdoing in the Vatican, right? Well, the truth of it is, quite often, these stories actually initiate outside the Vatican with shady financiers, many of them Italians, not exclusively, but, preponderantly, I guess we could say, Italians, who kind of look at the Vatican as a sort of, metaphorical ATM machine, that if you just push a few buttons, it will spit out some cash. And so they try to get their tentacles into the system. Now, occasionally, they are able to hoodwink or corrupt a Vatican official or two. But my point is this. Many stories that we think of as Vatican corruption stories, in a lot of instances, the Vatican is more like a kind of innocent bystander, and the prime movers and the architects of these corruption schemes are outside the Vatican. Sometimes they succeed in breaching the Vatican walls. That's the London story. Sometimes they don't. That's the current story with Visco and his cronies. But in any event, just bear in mind, the Vatican is quite often a target of this kind of illicit activity. And therefore, if we really want to protect the integrity of Vatican finances, it's not enough to reform the inside. We also have to be much more careful about who we let in from the outside. All right, finally this week we have When the Cows Come Home. So Sunday, rainy day here in Rome, Pope Francis celebrated his traditional noontime Angelus address. The Vatican gendarmes, that is the Vatican police force, says there were about 15,000 people in St. Peter's Square. But you know what they did not put in their official communique? That was 15,000 people and one cow. Because the celebrity guest in St. Peter's, well, actually just outside St. Peter's Square on Sunday, was Ercolina II. She is a cow who has become the leading public symbol of farmers' protests here in Italy. Like much of Europe, farmers in Italy currently are engaged in some very high-profile public protests. They are objecting to falling food prices, rising production costs, European Union regulations that they believe related to climate change that they believe are hampering their competitiveness and adding to their cost burden, and they are looking for relief. In Italy, farmers have driven their tractors into Rome. They actually, on Friday, made a round just around the Colosseum to call attention to their plight. And they have brought with them this famous cow, Ercolina II, who was just recently at the country's most famous music festival in Sanremo with a sign saying, "No farms, no future." And on Sunday, her owner and another farmer brought her to St. Peter's Square in an attempt to get a papal blessing. By the way, Ercolina comes from a very distinguished lineage. She is known as Ercolina II because her mother, Ercolina I, actually was in St. Peter's Square in December 1997 during another farm protest. She actually had the opportunity to receive a blessing from the late St. Pope John Paul II. Ercolina II was not quite as fortunate because security forces kept her out of St. Peter's Square. There's no evidence that the Pope knew she was there. He did not refer to her during his comments. However, all was not lost because passersby and pilgrims at the Angelus were treated to samples of fresh milk from Ercolina II as her owner milked her into a metal pan and then spread it around in plastic cups to anyone who wanted a taste of Ercolina II's particular product. And so there you have it. The Pope was, cheek by jowl in a sense, with the leading symbol of farm protest. Francis has always been a champion, a little guy. You have to think if he had known Ercolina was there would have been a shout out. But in any event, she certainly made her presence felt. All right, that is our show this week. You can find full coverage of all of these stories on the Crux site. That is cruxnow.com. Again, a reminder, I will be absent next Tuesday on the video, but you can find my coverage and everything else people are doing on the Crux site. I will be back the Tuesday after that. So we are going to be missing one another for a fortnight for these next 2 weeks. Stay safe, stay healthy, have a fantastic, blessed time. If you're in the Southland, come see me. If not, be thinking of me. We will talk to you again very soon.